Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our wonderful event today. My name is Anna Petrov, and I'm a professor at the University of Toronto at the Slavic department. I am leading the Czech and Slovak program, and together today with the Consulate of the Czech Republic, we have the wonderful opportunity to welcome our guest, Professor Igor Lukes, who will be talking today about East Central Europe from the 1993 to 2023, about successes and failures. And before I introduce our Consul General of the Czech Republic and Professor Lukes, I would like just to thank for the wonderful opportunity and organizing this event that the Consulate General of the Czech Republic planned for all of us, and to thank to Ceres and to support of the families Siptak and Stansky for making this event possible. I'm welcoming all of you who came today in person. I'm glad to see that there is a lot of us who are in person again, and also I'm welcoming all of you who are following this event online. After the presentation of Professor Lukes, we will be opening the discussion. You will be able to put the questions, and of course, we will be following questions on through the Zoom. So please feel free to write down your thoughts and questions, and later in the discussion period, we can talk about that. So once again, welcome. And now I would like to present you the Consul General of the Czech Republic, Petr Burianek, who will be telling something more about the whole event.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming, everybody. Thank you also to my colleagues from the diplomatic corps to attend this event. And my role here is just to present our guest, Professor Igor Lukes. He is the professor of the Boston University, US. Professor Lukes was educated at Charles University in Prague, and in the late 1970s, he immigrated to United States, and it was during of course, the regime ruled Czechoslovakia this time. And he spent almost his entire career in academia at the Boston University. His main scholarly interest is the history of the Central and Eastern Europe in the 20th century, as well as the contemporary events in the region and also in today's Russia. Professor Lukes is author of the extensive works such as Czechoslovakia between Stalin and Hitler, diplomacy of Edvard Beneš in the 1930s. Beneš was firstly Minister of Foreign Affairs and later President of Czechoslovakia before, during, and after Second World War until the Communist Cup in 1948. The other work done by Professor Lukes is On the Edge of the Cold War. It's about US diplomacy during the Communist Cup in Czechoslovakia and many other. Professor Lukes is also well known in the Czech public as a commentator on current events in North America, but also in the Czech Republic, Central Europe, and of course, everything what's happening now in Eastern Europe, particularly in Russia and Ukraine. This year marks 30 years since the division of Czechoslovakia in 1993, and today our two countries have excellent relations with each other, as well with their neighbors. Both Czech Republic and Slovakia are members of the European Union and NATO. And although the division of Czechoslovakia, which formed one state for 75 years, not easy for many of our inhabitants, today we remain very friendly, very closely, and very cooperating. The lecture and discussion with Professor Lukes will certainly be also an appropriate occasion for a reminder of this recent events. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for coming. I'm sure you haven't invited me to hear just fluff it would have been easy for me to say, well, you know, things are wonderful, everything's positive, and so on. So if I focus on, or if it seems that I'm focusing on the negative, it isn't because I'm some sort of a Schwarzseher, that's I think Bismarck's term, that I'm some sort of a, you know, pathological pessimist. It's that I think on balance, it's always important, especially when one is among friends, to focus on the negatives, because this is how one reminds oneself that things need to be improved. I will start with a few observations that I think many of you will find well known, but I think it's important that we sort of get on the same wavelength. So I've divided the presentation into 4 quick, short segments. And in the first one, I want to address the one that no nation really chooses, and that's geopolitics. God or fate or whatever one believes in places a specific nation on the map. And according to many, some of them very well known and smart, Henry Kissinger comes to mind, geography is destiny. But not always and not for everyone. So if I show you this historical map of Mitteleuropa, Central Europe, I'm always reminded of a beautiful scene that I think I read in a Polish novel. It may have been Imperium, if I'm not mistaken. But in any case, it started with a group of Polish filmmakers who were in a cab in Havana, and they were chattering with each other in Polish. And clearly the driver, some amateur linguist, was keen to find out what language these people were talking. And so finally he said, "Where are you from?" And they said, "Poland." So this Cuban driver, this is in the 80s, says, "Where's Poland?" And they say, "Well, between Germany and Russia." And apparently, according to the author, the driver let go of the steering wheel. He threw his hands in the air and he said, "Santa Maria, how can anybody live there?" And yes, it is indeed a part of the map over which the forces of East and West collided and collided repeatedly. Balkans is obviously another fault line where empires collide, religions collide, and so on. You all know that very well, I'm sure. It's been noted by other people. It's not that I invented it, that one of the big issues that both East and West neighbors of Central Europe have had in common is that it was never quite clear where they started and when they ended. The whole 19th century in Germany is a big debate, a struggle between German patriots, what sort of Germany there ought to be. Should it be the Kleindeutsche? Should it be the Großdeutsche solution for Germany? And what do we do with the Habsburg Empire, right? Where they also spoke German. Were they German? All of these were totally legitimate questions. To cut a long story short, at the end of World War II, Germany accepted the borders dictated by the outsiders, and it's subsequently went on to become really a shining star among European diplomacies, European democracies, a country that really sets the standard when it comes to democracy, human rights, and so on for others around the world. With Russia, it's never really been even similar. And Russia is, in fact, a country that has a hard time figuring out where it starts and where it ends. One would have had to be napping in the past 3 years not to hear constantly about the so-called Russian insecurity and how the West had somehow conspired ever since the end of the Cold War to gobble up more real estate in Central Europe in order to somehow make Russia more vulnerable, perhaps even to destroy it. Some of the views that you can hear on Russian TV news are just absolutely shocking. The truth is that the very concept of insecurity for Russia was invented by Stalin in a speech that he gave in 1931. And in that speech, Stalin said that historically Russia had been beaten by the Mongols, it had been beaten by the Tatars, had been beaten by the Poles, had been beaten by the Lithuanians, by the Swedes, by the French, by obviously the Nazis. And because of this history, no degree of security that's perfectly acceptable for France or for Denmark or for Norway is acceptable for Russia. That Russia allegedly has suffered so much from these foreign invasions that it has a legitimate claim to have more security than any other nation on earth. If that's true, then how is it possible that already Marx and Engels noted that Russia, which started somewhere on the European side in 1613, has managed to enlarge into the biggest land piece of real estate really on this planet, if Russia is nothing but an innocent victim, this fragile little flower that's constantly being plucked by hated foreigners, then how is it possible that we have the greatest country on earth called Russia? And that's even true, actually, even after the breakup of the Soviet Union. I'm kicking myself now that I didn't really pick up on this article, which still hasn't been translated into English, but it was written by Surkov, who was the chief PR advisor to Mr. Putin, and who is the founder of Yedinstvo, the political party that he created for Mr. Putin. And he wrote this article where he deliberately used the term shameful peace, which is what in American English would be called a dog whistle, a reference to the Versailles Germany, the Germany that hated the diktat that came out of the peace conference in 1919. And so when Surkov talks about shameful peace, he is deliberately making a reference to Germany in the interwar era in the 20s and 30s, where one man whose name I don't even want to pronounce here made a great deal of political capital by talking about the shameful peace that was dictated by the Allies. And here is Surkov, 9 days before the invasion of Ukraine. And here I'm summoning up the article for you in 3 points, but this is really an accurate reflection of what Surkov said. And I think this is a reference basically back to 1931 when Stalin came up with this concept. We are vulnerable. We are constantly being invaded by foreigners. We became the biggest country on earth somehow in the middle of the night, and we don't know how that happened, right? But here it is. And the outcome is that the neighbors of Russia see themselves as victims of Russia's aggressions. As you can see, there is no Poland on the map. I can't really see any Hungary. I see Romania, but I see no Hungary. There is, I think, somewhere Bohemia, but I think the Bohemian is just beating up on a German, which is probably a reference to the end of the 19th century. But here you see the kind of discrepancy between Russia that perceives itself as an innocent victim of foreign aggressions whereas all the others see it as a steamroller that is sort of rolling over other territories. Now, as long as the Habsburg Empire existed in Middle Europa, Germany and Russia were kept apart. And essentially, the only key to stability of Central Europe, and therefore stability of Europe as such, is when Germany and Russia are kept apart. And this was the role of the otherwise very flawed, we all know that, a very imperfect Habsburg Empire, but it certainly played a positive, constructive role in stabilizing events. There is no diplomat who would deny that the Congress of Vienna of 1815 had a more than really positive impact on the stability of Europe, because it gave us 99 years of peace, give and take. There were some skirmishes by the standards of the 20th century, but nothing like the horrors that happened in the 20th century after the destruction, however you want to look at it, of the Habsburg Empire. And from my point of view, and I believe from the geopolitical view of Central Europe, East Central Europe, Middle Europa, the ultimate tragedy was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which I think to this day, remarkably, has been really understudied. And it's sort of easy to this day to spread disinformation about how this came about. Many people just say that poor Stalin was manipulated to sign this agreement by the anti-communists in London and the horrible anti-communists in France. Of course, there were anti-communists in France and England. I'm not denying that, but I certainly would dispute that. In fact, there is archival evidence that at least since 1935, Stalin intended to sign a deal with Adolf Hitler that would result in the division of Eastern Europe into zones of interest. Einflusszonen, I think, was the expression. And of course, the Stalin-Hitler Pact is the ultimate symbol of that. And of course, it was catastrophic for the whole world, that pact, because it enabled Hitler's attack on Poland and therefore the outbreak of World War II. But it was especially catastrophic from the point of view of Poland. And this, of course, gave rise to World War II, and the victorious alliance ultimately, quote unquote, solved the question of East Central Europe by surrendering the area to Joseph Stalin. And so the concept of Yalta Europe always meant Europe that is so cleanly divided into zones of influence that no side presumes to have the right to as much as comment really on events on the other side. Simply, cuius regio, eius religio. Who rules, he determines the religion, right? This is the old Westphalian system. Sovereignty is everything. Sovereigns don't sit in judgment of each other, right? So what you do with your people is your business, and it has really nothing to do with us. And therefore, human rights and so on, it was always presumed to be somehow anti-communist and provocative. And many people were upset when Jimmy Carter, God bless him, he's facing probably in the last days of his life, moments of his life. But I remember when he and Brzezinski in the 70s came up. In fact, I was inspired by the two to escape and to become an American. When they started talking about human rights, that to me was a whole new chapter that opened in the East-West relations. And basically, every smart, rational person would tell you, cuius regio, eius religio. You know, whatever they do on their side of the divide, we, as rational adults, given the existence of nuclear weapons, would not touch with a 10-foot pole. So we may, let's say, as the Federal Republic, as the federal government of Germany, we may pay for East German political prisoners so that they could come to the United States. But we will publicly say as little as possible, because it could be destabilizing, it might be perceived as provocative. But there was one country, there was one nation that did not really grow up, that was not in the category of these rational adults. And they said, we don't care what the outside world does. We don't consider it binding on us. We are an autonomous people. And I think when Michnik says here, we don't want Reagan to come and help us. We're not waiting for the Marines to come and make us sovereign and free. We'll do it ourselves. And we don't care about the P-2, the Pershing II, which was the American response to the SS-20, right? And they were right, because when you now interview people who worked for Reagan, like John Whitehead, who was directly responsible for East Central Europe during the Reagan administration, they all tell you there was no expectation, there was no intention that we would ever separate Eastern Europe from the Soviet Union. It was never anyone's expectation. In fact, not only did the West, and specifically the United States, assert publicly, like John Kennedy to Khrushchev during their summit meeting in Vienna in the early 1960s, Kennedy said, Eastern Europe is yours. We consider that area to be your jurisdiction. And Khrushchev just waved it off, like said, of course, that's not a gift you were giving us. We already have that. What else do you have? So there were people like Kissinger and obviously Sonnenfeld, who was his guy for Eastern Europe. And they were absolutely clear. Whenever some East European person came to the National Security Council in the 1980s and in the 70s, they would say, in fact, this was a Romanian delegation that came in the 80s. And they were kind of hinting that they were unhappy about Soviet pressures for Romania to play a more obvious role in the Warsaw Pact. And Sonnenfeld said, it's all the map. The Soviet Union can't help but have an interest in you because you're there where you are. Therefore, it's never going to change. And in fact, those two, sometimes tongue-in-cheek, I presume, but only because I want to give them the benefit of the doubt, said that the East Europeans should in fact pay for the Red Army being deployed in that area because it stabilized the scene. You know, they said, look, we haven't had a nuclear war. There hasn't been World War III. And that's because there is a clear, clean division. In other words, Yalta is good. Enjoy it. You may not be, as happy as the Danes or the Norwegians and so on, but it really has to do with the map. So again, if I now focus on the post-89 events, please don't be confused if I say more about certain negative things rather than, of course, things have improved enormously. First of all, there is no Red Army in the area. The totalitarian, authoritarian governments are gone. This is incredible. 1989 was a true miracle. So it was a miracle, but the problem was that precisely because it was a miracle, precisely because the West had not worked to achieve that objective, it was unprepared. When the gift fell into the lap of the West, it didn't really know what to do with it. I remember, for instance, the German constitution always stipulated that there was only one Germany, and that the people in East Germany were temporarily unable to exercise their rights as citizens of the Federal Republic. But that was a temporary affair. And all of a sudden, you had tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, escaping through Hungary, escaping through the embassy in Prague, German embassy in Prague, also some in Warsaw. And the German consular officers were handing out passports of the Federal Republic like this automatically, because they were caught by their own constitution. They were forced to do so, right? And this is what happens when unexpected things happen. And so 89 was unexpected. The West was unprepared for it. H.W. Bush, that is, had really zero interest in East Central Europe. Clinton, it's true, he presided over the expansion of NATO, but that was only because the Secretary of State had Czech roots, and she was a student of Zbigniew Brzezinski's, and those two, this Pole and the Czech. And of course, Clinton had his own problems up to here. So he was not going to stand in their way. He didn't need any sort of hysterics. So he, let it go. But no adult in Washington supported it. People like George Kennan were against it. Jack Matlock, all the superstars of American foreign service, totally against it. Something like 75 retired American ambassadors wrote a letter published in the New York Times. New York Times was against it. Wall Street Journal was against it. They all said this is destabilizing. America will be drawn into wars because of the fluid borders in Galicia. I remember that expression. And so East Central Europe, totally on its own. And I was on a Fulbright in Prague at that time. And I remember the first things that came to the West, from the West were Marlboro cigarettes, liquor, Playboy magazine. My mother worked for a children's books publisher that went belly up instantly, and the building was taken over by Playboy. Cosmopolitan magazine started flooding the scene, and with the sensational headlines and so on. And this is a kind of confusing slide. I'm wondering if anybody can really understand what I mean by this. But this is an American pilot who had spent 5 years being tortured in Hanoi. They broke his arms, really mistreatment for 5 years, nonstop. And here he is returning to the bosom of his family. And I think almost makes me cry, but if you look at the joyful faces of his family, you see that it's a totally authentic emotion. Right? Before the year was over, they were divorced. Because it's just an illusion that you can come out of 5 years in Hanoi Hilton, where they starve you, beat you, break your arms, and then you become a wonderful husband and father, and the wife who spent 5 years or more taking care of four teenagers while her husband was away. And of course, the photograph on the right, you may recognize, there is even a statue to him in in Berlin these days. This is an East German soldier who watches the Berlin Wall coming up, and at some point he throws away his cigarette. He throws away his automatic and jumps to the west. He hanged himself. So my argument here is that it is an illusion that you take a bunch of countries like East Central Europe that endured 6 years of World War II, and then I don't know how many decades of communism, and then you say, well, now you're free, have a cigarette and have a drink and read Playboy, and now you're just like the West. That's not the way it works. And yes, I know the West, of course, has its own problems. I see potholes on American streets that are bigger than anything I've seen in any European country, including the Balkans. And so I know that every country is responsible for its own. But what East Central Europe needed was not money. It needed advice. It needed sort of ethical advice. I don't know if you know Leszek Kolakowski. He's a Polish philosopher whom I read and adored. I will give you a moment to read this idea on your own. So what I think I'm trying to say is that what East Central Europe really needed was not so much a investments, billions of dollars, people coming in to build their airports and pave their roads. What I think the area needed was in the realm of ethics and morality. When Hitler was defeated and Nazism was crushed, it was the outsiders who helped the German people to denazify the country. And it was a crucial component because without the outside pressure, there would have been not enough sort of self-reflection in 45, 46, 47 to come to terms with the horror of Auschwitz and places of Schrecklichkeit, as the Germans now correctly use that term. And I think similarly, East Central Europe needed advice on sort of how to distinguish between right and wrong after all these decades of twisted values and sort of mergings of right and wrong and so on. As an American college professor, I can't tell you how many times I have received somebody in my office who comes to inquire about a particular student, and they say, John Smith or James Smith has applied for a job, and if they succeed, they would gain access to classified information. What can you tell me about them? Have you noticed anything that should cause concern? It's called vetting. It's called security clearance. Every Western country does it. Canada does it. Everybody does it. And when the East Europeans started tentatively suggesting in the 1990s that there was some sort of a general policy that they should come up with in order to determine what to do with their ugly past, there was not only no help from the West. In fact, the West was very skeptical. But even more concerning was that some of the leading East European dissidents, the brilliant Michnik, whom I already quoted, and Havel, they said, look, it is just a kind of a fairy tale to think that it was all black and white. Real life is very complicated. Nobody was totally good. Nobody was totally evil. And in a way, Havel said it, we're all guilty. Well, yes, But if all are guilty, then nobody is guilty. Then nobody is guilty. And then we can just pretend that we're all clean and let's just forget about it. But the point is that you can't really build a stable house on shaky foundations. And what I think Central Europe needed in the early 1990s would have been a push from the outside that would have said, look, this person tortured somebody to death. And he's now 70, so it's not that we want him to die in prison, but maybe there should be some sort of a legal procedure that would say it's wrong to torture people. It's wrong to do things that are against the laws of even that communist system. I mean, Mazowiecki was a Catholic intellectual, very decent human being, right? But he also believed that you just turn the other cheek, you know, you have to love your enemy, and we are all brothers and sisters. It doesn't really work somehow. Especially when the Nazi regime lasted for only 12 years. The communist regime was there much longer, and it had every opportunity to penetrate deeper into the fabric of Czech society, of the East European societies. So here I say, if you look at the Gestapo numbers, and this is before Germany occupied Europe, you had one officer for 2,000 Germans. There is some debate as to how many Stasi agents there were. And if you take the highest number, which in some cases may include even family members, then you have one Stasi agent for 8 East German citizens. But let's say 60. But even that shows you how deeply that regime was in the fabric of society. And what was weird about it is that, for instance, the United States, rather than pushing for lustrations, that's the East European term for vetting, they in fact thought that it was somehow uncouth or primitive or, you know, hateful. There were all sorts of negative. In fact, there was even a push to put the Czech Republic, or maybe even Czechoslovakia at that point, on a list of human rights abusers because of lustrations, because it could result in Berufsverbot, that some people would be denied employment on the grounds of having been vetted positively. So here are a few examples about how the East Europeans had failed to clean up their own operation. So in Poland, they basically presumed that everybody is a hero. Since 10 million Poles were in solidarity, therefore we're all clean as fallen snow. Everybody is a heroic fighter against communism. And then a government collapsed because it turned out that a minister was an active agent of Russian intelligence. But I do understand why people are unhappy about archives, because if you look at archives of a totalitarian or authoritarian regime, you discover that human beings are complicated. We are capable of greatness, and we are capable of swinish things. It's in us. We are not sort of all angels or all devils. Human beings are complicated. So here you have Wałęsa, the very symbol of anti-communist resistance. And he was, in fact, on at least 2 occasions, separate occasions, a paid informer of the secret police. There are people who study archives with great attention, and they say that in the Polish church, the secret police penetration was especially visible, where you have up to 15% of some of the best-known priests. Like there was I don't know if you remember Father Popieluszko, who was murdered by the secret police. His roommate, another priest, was a secret police informer who called the police the moment Popieluszko left and said, "Package on the way." There were several informers who were very close to John Paul II, also secret police informers. Life is complicated. It isn't anything surprising. Right? We are capable of greatness, and we're capable of doing evil things. The same was true in the Czech Republic. There is a divisive case of Mr. Vonka, who was a very famous prisoner, political prisoner. He attempted to run for presidency, and instead the government threw him in prison, and he was in and out of prison for several years, and ultimately he started holding hunger strikes, and one day he was found dead next to the toilet, apparently with the toilet seat around his head. This is a handwritten statement by Pavel Vonka, who demanded that the secret police use him as a secret police informer. And in fact, he started rebelling against the police because he wanted to be a spy, communist spy in Germany. He was ethnically German and spoke very good German, so he wanted to emigrate to Germany but to be really an agent of the communist intelligence. They thought he was a loose cannon. They refused to do it, and he died this way. Was he a hero, or was he a horrible person? Well, he was both. Somebody dies this way at the hands of their government. I think they are victims of a horrible case of injustice. But at the same time, he was not an angel. Life is complicated. In the Czech Republic, life or the concept of lustrations was almost immediately relativized by a man who I think had a great ambition to make a big career in foreign service. And it turned out that Jan Kavan, in fact, had been a secret police spy in Great Britain for many years. There are boxes of material on him. Some of the latest boxes are missing. Undoubtedly, they were destroyed because they contained the juiciest material. But when this man was lustrated, and they, in fact, asked him to leave political life, public political life, he started a campaign in the West that immediately produced articles in all these influential periodicals like The New Yorker and others that talked about from Kafka to Dreyfus and witch hunt and so on. No, he was an informer who took money from Czech spies in London after he gave them dirt on fellow Czech emigre students studying at the London School of Economics and at Oxford. And when the lustration law failed to be fully applied, Mr. Kavan went on to become the foreign minister in total violation of all these archival documents that you see the name Cato there on the cover. And he is active to this day. He just co-sponsored a resolution which demands that the West immediately cease to support Ukraine because it's all a waste of time. Ukraine will ultimately be under Russian influence, whatever we say about it. Another hugely interesting case is the former Czech president Klaus, who in the early 1990s, nobody was more libertarian than he was. Nobody was more American than he was. And then all of a sudden, he said it's the European Union that in fact is the modern dictatorship. And life was better under Brezhnev for Eastern Europe than under the diktat of Brussels. And when you look at the website of his when you look at the website of his institute, so this is a man who was, a prime minister, financial minister, prime minister, and president 2 terms. And he thinks the world is going down because of environmentalism. He thinks it's all invented by leftists. Cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism, human rightism, that he invented that word. And of course, homosexualism. He thinks that's the greatest danger to humanity is homosexualism. I don't know about those tied to genes. Maybe don't allow him to have enough blood in his brain. And the weird thing is that just like Kavan, these people never go away. They never go away. And so when it comes to MH17, Syria, Skripal, Ukraine, he simply repeats things that come from the Kremlin propaganda. Like, I really love the idea that Crimea belongs to Russia because they speak Russian. That's exactly what the Nazis were saying about the Sudetenland. Then give up Sudetenland. They speak German. You have no rights there, right? Austria, speak German. Right? It's Germany. So this is another gentleman, just a recent prime minister of the Czech Republic, a great friend of Mr. Trump. He really hates foreigners. He himself is from Slovakia, but he hates foreigners. He wants the Czech Republic to be ethnically pure. So, fine. Well, here is a document how he had a code name as a spy working for the first directorate of the Czech secret police. He was a spy working in the Middle East. This is his code name, Boresh. And here it says, how was he recruited? And it says, volunteered. If they, like in the case of Wałęsa, this was a man who had, 7 children. It was 4 a.m. They had been screaming at him that he will never see his family again. And just to get out of it, he says he signed it. And I believe him. But this guy, there was no hardship. And of course, these people, as I said, they don't go away. This is like 3 days old. Here is Mr. Babiš, no longer the prime minister, but my daughter, who likes fashion, she tells me that this jacket costs over $1,000. It's a Prada jacket. My daughter just takes one look and she says $1,200. And there he is talking to the trade unionists about the impoverishment of the country because the treasonous government supports Ukraine. How much time do I have? I really don't. I'm already running out of time.
It's okay. Let's say it's about 10 minutes, 10-15 minutes more.
Okay, I will finish in 10 minutes at most. So please don't panic. So, there are many other cases we can look at, but I think it suffices if I say that word that's projected on the Czech castle says high treason. And again, there is considerable evidence that money was transferred to Mr. Zeman for both his political campaigns. Just as in the case of Klaus, who's all his books that deny global warming and claim that global warming is invented by neo-Marxists in Brussels, all his books were translated into like 27 languages, and it's paid for by Lukoil. Lukoil pays for those translations. Unfortunately, something fairly similar is or was underway in Poland, where Mr. Kaczynski's political party, PiS, was absolutely adamant that not a single Muslim would be allowed to cross the Polish borders. Poland, under Mr. Kaczynski, I think this is an innovative cover of the Polish version of Newsweek, did what what's his name, Netanyahu has tried to do or has been trying to achieve in Israel. In other words, manipulate the courts in order to be able to push through your own political initiatives. There is going to be soon another election, and there seems to be no hope that the opposition will be able to challenge him in any credible manner, although the KO, which is a collection of 4 or 5 opposition parties, although they came together, they're like 10 points at least behind. In Hungary, it is slightly different because it's worse, and it's worse in Hungary because Orban is vastly more intelligent than Kaczynski. Orban is a very clever politician who knows how to play the game, and he's surrounded by lawyers who also are very, very nimble on their feet. If you look at some of the recent developments in the EU, especially now regarding Ukraine, you realize why Mr. Putin would have invested so heavily in countries like Hungary. I just have to move through this quickly, but this is, if you've been to Budapest, you recognize the bridge. It's a landmark of the city. This is a very historic building. And when Brussels said to Hungary, this really doesn't look all that good if you were so close to Putin, he said, oh, you're trying to dictate to me? And he invited this IIB, which is known as a bank that supports Russian external intelligence, SVR. So he too plays the game. On the one hand, he is friends with Putin. On the other hand, he was at least friends with Trump. When Orban goes to Israel, he is to the right of Netanyahu. And he says, look, the best way of dealing with this issue with Palestinians is just to deport them. Just put them on some buses and ship them out and you're done. What's your problem? Defend your borders, right? And then he comes home and says, that's all I do. I don't do anything other than Netanyahu. And then when he speaks to his domestic audiences, this is another text that immediately brings up the word dog whistle to mind, because here he's talking about George Soros, the Jewish American investor whom Orban promoted into a sort of a great enemy. The point that I want to make here is that in 2020, finally, Brussels said, if you manipulate your courts like this, then you can no longer claim to be a country ruled by the rule of law, governed by the rule of law, and therefore will have to initiate what they call Article 7, which could result in separating that country from the European Union. You can see those two extreme declines. That's Hungary and Poland in just the course of 3-4 short years. Let me say very quickly about the economic transformation, that it has become a kind of a commonplace cliche, that the reason why it was imperfect was that it was launched before there existed a firm legal framework within which the transfer of billions of dollars could be organized. It sounds good. It sounds good, but it was a pie in the sky. It was waiting for Godot if you were hoping to have a firm enforceable legal framework. In fact, this is what Cortes did when he reached the Americas. He moved everyone off the boats and then he burned them. And then he said, now we go forward. We can't go back. And the idea for the privatizers was to launch the privatization as quickly as possible in order that if Russia were to renew its interest in East Central Europe, it would run into an entirely different society. There would be a group of private owners who would have a vested interest in the defense of the new regime versus the old one. So if you now look at any East European stores, any East European store, the difference is just enormous. It's fantastic, right? The problem is that everything comes with a cost. So if you invite Lidl or any of the French supermarket networks, they bring their own products. And so you can't buy a yogurt in a Lidl that's produced locally because Lidl brings its own yogurts from Germany. So all the local dairies just go belly up. The butchers lose their ability to sell their products. The farmers are displaced because these big networks bring obviously much more appetizing and much better presented products to the consumer. I remember in this small town of Hocein, it's surrounded by woods full of blueberries. They sell blueberries from Canada. That's globalization. So Germany has played an incredibly creative and positive role in the building up of East Central Europe from the horrible situation that you see reflected there on the left. But that too has a consequence, and the consequence is that all these countries, Slovakia, obviously, there plays a major role. 13% of the GDP comes from auto industry, and it's mostly German or South Korean. All of this is hugely important, but the problem is that they basically became a workshop. And wages are determined by added value. Productivity reflects, or wages reflect productivity. And productivity is measured by added value. And if you attach a door to a car, it's not the same as inventing a new software program. So you see that the differences between, let's say, Austria and Germany are still more than 30 years after the end of communism are significant. And I think even within Germany, you see, I think the difference is, correct me, it's roughly about 5% or so between the former, the so-called new lands, I think it's called in German, in the East and West German lands. So here is basically where I explain why salaries remain lower in East Central Europe. And it really has to do with the structure of jobs, that the jobs in Eastern Europe that were created. Anyway, here is one really bittersweet, very, very bittersweet and final segment. And that is that the horror of the Ukrainian tragedy needs not to be obviously here repeated. We all know what it is, and I don't have to go over it, right? But what I want to say is that it is the Ukrainian tragedy that in a way saved East Central Europe from further decline, from further backsliding from democracy toward some sort of authoritarian regime. It certainly is perfectly visible in Poland, which before Putin's war was really on its way of being kicked out of Brussels. And now Poland has become one of the most important pillars of NATO and a very important partner in the European Union. And it's true even in the human dimension, because having treated the refugees from Syria, Afghanistan in such a beastly, cruel, cynical manner, the Poles, the Czechs, all of them, Hungarians, they have completely changed when it comes to the Ukrainians. And I think Poland really led the way, and the Czechs are as good or even better if you apparently calculate it per capita. It seems that the Czechs have accepted the most refugees. It's here is a kind of a reminder. This is Law and Justice. That's the Kaczynski party. That's the Peace Party, PIS. And this indicates how many times they abstained when the European Parliament tried to pass a resolution against Putin's aggression. And this stopped once the war started, because they now see that that everything is on the line. The Czech-Polish relations in the Visegrad 4 organization were extremely tense. Poland and the Czechs sued each other in various international forums. That's over. They know that this is not the time to quarrel about some coal mine. Now the idea is to come together and prepare for Mr. Putin's challenges. I think it's a miracle that the Polish-Ukrainian relations, which historically had been so tragic, so many people died over centuries, that they have now been so vastly improved. But I think even from the perspective of the West, it's been saved in a way, because just before the war had broken out, many in Central Europe had started suggesting that there was really no difference between the East and the West. They're all the same. They all just want to dictate. They all want to be, they have contempt for us. They want to exploit us. They want to, enrich themselves at our expense. And that's over. Nobody believes this anymore. People now know who the good guys are, and they know what the bad guys can do. So since I ran out of time, this was just a reminder that one could say that Mr. Putin has been the most successful CIA agent in the Russian system, because he achieved all these great things that somehow are not very good for Russia. But anyway, he achieved it. Poland is now the one country one can definitely trust. If something bad were to happen in East Central Europe, these are tough customers. They would fight to the end. They would not surrender an inch of territory. And I think the West now sees it. And they now go to Warsaw and talk to all those people, because they see that while in the West there is now a kind of unholy alliance between the extreme right and the extreme left, who basically want to abolish or support for Ukraine. If you want to find countries that are unshakably supported, you go to East Central Europe. So this is my last slide. I'm sorry it took me so long to share it with you, and thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you for amazing presentation. As you were saying, good and bad at the same time. So I would like to open the discussion, and feel free to raise your hand and to ask if you have some questions to Professor Lukes, or if you have any comment or something to add, please feel free to do that. Yes, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. That was quite an interesting presentation. Since you addressed me on the GDP thing, I just looked it up, so that the spread of the per capita GDP in Germany is in the same range as the per capita GDP spread within the European Union. So the former Eastern German countries, states, have a lower GDP, per capita GDP.
But it's been declining. The gap is declining.
The gap is between 70,000 euro and 30,000 euros. So that's a huge gap where we're talking about. So what I'm trying to say is that the gap between some of the East European countries in Germany is also reflected within Germany, between the Eastern German states and the Western European states. And as for Lidl, for example, that is a good example for a company that is basically all over Europe and has contracts with local producers, and not only offering local products, of course, on the local market, but also exporting or helping to export local products all over Europe. So no matter where you are in Europe, you have a Greek week or whatever, Italian week, a French week.
That's true.
So Lidl is a supporter of local producers, not the opposite. Sorry, but as the German Consul General, I of course tend to speak for Germany.
And for me. Thank you so much for your comment. Yes, please.
So thank you, Professor. You told us at the beginning that you will pick up maybe more darker part of the recent history, and I would like to use your words that nothing is black and white. So it's just on some of your comments. I would like maybe listen your view, because I can agree what you said about Western countries not be prepared for the collapse of the communist regime and for everything what happened in '89 in Central Europe. Although we could see that during the Gorbachev era, there were already some signals that the things would change very quickly. How do you see the process of the reunification of Germany to help, let's say, accept the the future membership of NATO for the other Central European countries, because this process of the reunification of Germany started immediately after the collapse of communist Soviet bloc in the Central Europe, which was not the case of the, let's say, readiness of the Western allies to accept the future membership of NATO. So what I'm trying to say that for me, the reunification of Germany was the first step to convince the Western countries to accept Central European countries to become the part of NATO.
Yeah, well, it's a very complicated, it was a very complicated business. On the surface, it seemed, certainly Chancellor Kohl was, I think, a kind of a Paganini of politics, you know, everything seemed so smooth. It was really very complicated. What people have failed to appreciate is that there was a great deal of resistance to the notion of German unity on the part of the West.
Right.
By far the worst was Maggie Thatcher, who in fact angrily called Gorbachev and demanded that he use the Red Army to close the Berlin Wall that had just been breached, because she was not going to allow a unification of Germany. Mitterrand in France also thought in terms of 1870, 1871, the Franco-Prussian War, right? It was remarkable how much these people lacked any kind of true vision that could take the world to the 21st century. They were stuck in the 19th century. They had forgotten that Germany had become, as I said at the very beginning, not only because you were here, but I genuinely mean it. Germany is a shining example that you can pick up yourself from the ground and rebuild yourself into a shining example of democracy. The Americans, H.W. Bush, invited a whole group of Russian experts. I don't mean to, because I wasn't there, this gesture was stupid of me. Delete it. He invited a whole group of Russian experts to his summer home in Maine, and they had a seminar on, you know, can we allow a unified Germany, given that there is still the Soviet Union and what is happening over there. It was a mixed picture. So it was not at all a preordained. Chancellor Kohl managed to make it seem that it was a preordained development. It wasn't. As far as the NATO expansion was concerned, as I said, there was genuine resistance to it among anybody who was somebody. It passed primarily because the American public couldn't care less. They really paid no attention. But the really knowledgeable, influential people, they all opposed it. And I would now challenge them and say, how do you think the situation would work now if Estonia, Poland were not in NATO?
Yep.
It would be much worse. There would be much more tension. It would be much more legitimate to worry that Putin won't stop. As it is, I think he would stop. I'm not one of those who said that he is bound to advance further. I don't believe that. I think he recognizes the legitimacy of NATO.
Thank you for a question and for a comment. Yes, please. And then we have another.
So thank you so much. You brought up, of course, that the onset of sort of the intensified conflict last year helped, simmer out some of the tensions between the East Central European states and some of the Western European states within the EU. What I'm wondering is because obviously the war has mitigated those things, but we're all hoping that the war is going to end sooner rather than later, and two, that the war will end with Ukraine as independent and sovereign state, in which it will likely ultimately be integrated, hopefully, and also sooner rather than later, into the European Union and other Western-oriented institutions. So I guess what I'm asking is, do you think that integration, if or when it does occur, do you think that will help intensify or continue to relieve the tensions between East Central Europe and Western Europe? Because Ukraine demographically, historically, etc., shares many more characteristics with those East Central European states than the Western European.
Well, I'm a historian. You were asking about the future. I really don't have the foggiest idea. Anything can happen. But just as I don't see any real solution for the Ukrainian tragedy, as long as Putin is in the Kremlin, so I don't really see much improvement in Poland or Hungary as long as Kaczynski and Orban are there, because as I said, Orban is very smart and clever, and he really knows how to manipulate things. But Kaczynski, he simply buys people. Like, his electoral slogan was plus 500. Basically, every family for every child got 500 zloty. Well, all the salaried people voted for him. So all the teachers, cops, army people, anybody who has a fixed monthly paycheck coming, they all adore him. Whereas the others who say, we can't afford it, we need the money for something else, they are sawing off the branch on which they're sitting. I think what's happened here is that we have revealed the weakness of democracy, that basically people like Trump, with their utter cynicism, have shown that the public doesn't really worry so much if you lie. What they, in fact, insist on getting is some benefit from you. And as long as you can provide it, and you can, because you're not reaching into your own pocket, but you deal with the state, then the public, Orban, for instance, was one of the many slides I had to eliminate. He is incredibly invested in soccer stadiums. And when you take it, when you take the money he's invested into Hungarian soccer per capita, per one soccer fan, it's close to $20,000 that he's invested. Meanwhile, hospitals are empty because Hungarian doctors can find jobs in Germany, in Austria, where they get much better equipment and salaries that are 5 times what they get in Hungary. He doesn't care. Somehow the people vote for soccer rather than medical care. Why? I don't know. I think it shows the weakness of democracy. I'm becoming, in my old age, I'm becoming a monarchist.
Thank you for your question. Yes,
yes, thank you very much, Professor. I have a lot of different questions, and I'm not in line with your opinions. I'm at a consul at the Polish consulate here in Toronto. So I think that you, regarding the current government and Kaczynski, you have showed some simplified picture, and the picture in line with the current opposition in Poland. For example, you mentioned this program plus 500. Yes, this is the one of the most important thing, and I think that the Polish society there is has no problem with this program as a whole. So you can say that the Kaczynski bought the society with this program. The same program are existing in the Western countries in Europe. So please don't be, this is some kind of very important for all of us, and for the Polish family. And regarding for example, the justice system, there were a lot of abuses justice system before the peace victory in 2015. So that's why such a reform was launched by the Peace and Justice Party regarding, this is one point. Regarding the EU funds, the discussions are ongoing with our partner in Brussels. So please take this facts into consideration. And just to sum up, the Polish current government was elected in democratic elections. We are not an authoritarian country, and I think that we should respect the choice of the Polish citizens and Polish society. Thanks for this historical historical view. I'm sure the very important fact that you have stressed this Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. I think that we still have some lessons to take, and also it was a disaster not only for Poland but also for Baltic states, for Romania, for Finland. So we have a broader picture of many things. So,
no, absolutely. I do hope from the bottom of my heart that I didn't hurt your feelings. There are very few people who love Poland as much as I do.
okay.
Ever since the early 1970s, I have been a most committed Polonophile. I've traveled to Warsaw in search of Kołakowski and so on. And I'm sure what you say is true. I just really do worry about the social divisions that have now emerged in Polish society. It's not obviously only in Poland. We see it in the Israeli society. We see it in America, all over the place. But you see a real divide between the people, let's say young people in Warsaw, and the countryside. If you go to Warsaw these days, and I do it almost every summer, you see a thriving West European city. I would want to celebrate that and say, this is fantastic. After all these horrors of the war, World War II, horrors of the post-war era with all the freedom fighters being hunted in the woods and so on, and then communism, and then the heroic fight of solidarity and all of this. Let's just celebrate that we now are part of the West, and we've been able to profit from it. Poland has received significant sums of money. One of the slides I eliminated was specific versus how much money it paid into Brussels. So it pains me when I see that there are these conflicts that really have to do with things, not those things that matter, such as stopping Putin. Poland has acted heroically before anybody else even woke up. But why should we have a quarrel about abortions, gay rights? This is divisive. This is unnecessary. Anyway, this is just what I think.
Exactly. This is your opinion.
It is my opinion.
All right. Ours.
Thank you for your comment, and thank you. And you had another question.
Mr. Professor, I would like to ask you, we have dissident movement in Czechoslovakia, Charter 77, in Poland, Solidarność, in Hungary, Miklos Harashny, Olgoma in Romania. How do you see dissident movement in Russia now? Do you see any, I know you are a historian, but any future for Russian dissident movement in Russia, and how we could support this movement?
Well, you know, the Russian people have been obviously heroic in the past in fighting against the foreign invaders that Stalin always reminded us about. They have not been as good in resisting their own domestic evil oppressors. And that is a historical fact, right? I mean, how many uprisings were there against Stalin? Or I don't remember any, other than the tragic events in Ukraine, the Holodomor, and so on. Right? So I would not really bank on some sort of a massive domestic resistance against Putin. After all, even the Charter 77 that you mentioned initially had something like 130, 40 members. Right?
142.
Well, maybe not I think the day it was published, it was less than that.
240.
Well, all right. It was in a country of 14 million people, right? So it was pretty small. So I wouldn't really bank on it. And I think that if there is going to be a change, it would have to come from the military or from the intelligence services. I just don't see that it would come from the citizens. If you actually look at the opinion polls, it is really disheartening to see that Putin's approval ratings are around 82%. Now, a year into the war, with incredible losses at the front, I don't know how it's possible, but you know, people, of course, we can debate whether these opinion polls are accurate, but insofar that we know Levada is the one institution that can provide or tries to provide objective data, and from what I see, Putin remains popular with the public. So I would not expect a dissident movement strong enough to overthrow it.
Thank you. Yes, please, and then we can.
Yes, Professor, I want to ask a history question, not a future question. So I want
About what?
I want to ask a question about Serbia. It's a history question, not a future question. So I want to ask why, like recently, like Serbia seems like support Russia, not like other Eastern Europe and Central Europe countries. And what the behavior of Serbia will affect other Eastern Europe and Central Europe countries. And another question, I feel that those countries with who created prosperous history, for example, like Pan-Slavism, Greek Russianism, and Pan-Chinese nationalism, like those countries, I feel they are getting together. Including the war between Russia and Ukraine, I feel like they get united together. I'm just wondering, how do you think of this trend? Why it became such situation?
Yes, well, I have to confess that I didn't fully understand your second question. I will quickly try to answer your first question, and then please rephrase your second question. So, why is Serbia outside the pattern of that region's reaction to Putin's war on Ukraine? I'm sure there are more qualified people to answer it, but in my sort of amateurish way, I would submit that it has to do, first of all, with historical roots, historical causes that really take us back to the 19th century, when the Tsars often postured as defenders of the Slavic peoples, especially the Serbs, against the Ottoman Muslim Turkish Empire. And then in World War I and World War II, Serbia considered itself to be the darling of the West, right? In World War I, the war, in fact, broke out because of Austria's declaration of war on Serbia, which then triggered the infamous series of events that resulted in World War I. And so Serbia, I think, sort of considered itself to be the fair-haired boy of the West. In the 1990s, as Yugoslavia was falling apart, to total surprise of every Serb. I used to go there quite often in the 1990s during the tragic events. There were many Serbs who couldn't understand why the West somehow seemed to side with Croatia, whom the Serbs considered to be responsible for war crimes in World War II, Stasi and so on. Why the West sided with Croatia and other separatist elements and not Serbia. And this, I think, is what gave an impetus to Serbia leaving the context of all the other nations and becoming essentially the sole standing ally of Mr. Putin's Russia in the whole region.
And that was the whole question, yes. So thank you for your question. Go ahead, and then we have the next one.
Well, maybe adding to Serbia, Serbia is in a sort of difficult situation to a certain extent. On the one hand, Serbia wants to become a member of the European Union, and Vučić, the president, is trying hard to get there. On the other hand, they're in the population, being an Orthodox country, there's a lot of feeling of being sort of close to Russia, and Vučić is, of course, playing with the European Union. So I wouldn't say he's a staunch ally of Russia, but he's using the ties he has with Russia to put some pressure on the European Union to achieve the goal, becoming a member of the European Union. That would be an addition to what you said.
And there is also the question of Kosovo, which of course many Serbs
Absolutely.
really across the board consider to be their Jerusalem.
Absolutely.
And so since the Albanian Kosovars are Muslims, it adds another dimension to what the Consul General here identified, because that adds also the religious dimension, the divide between the Christians and the Muslims in the Balkans that, of course, historically is very long and very painful.
And on social divide you referred to social divide in the Polish society. I would say there's a lot of social divide in all of our societies. Look, like at my own country, Germany, where there is a divide between less prosperous and more prosperous regions, and some of the less prosperous regions I referred to in my previous comment are in the eastern part of Germany, and there you see a rise of populism, right-wing populism. Yeah. So it's not limited to Poland or Hungary or Germany. It happens in France. Look at Italy. So you have it in all our societies. I'm afraid, and that's the divide.
It has to do with the structure of economy, I think,
right,
to a great extent.
Right. With the urban, well-educated, well-off part of the population, and those people who feel a bit left behind. And the third thing I would like to comment on is what you referred to or alluded to at the very beginning of your talk, Russian feeling of insecurity. This is utterly wrong, of course. I mean, I'm supporting what you said. Russia signed the Russia-NATO Act, and it clearly stipulates that every country has a right to choose its allies. So, I mean, signed by Russia. Second thing, OSCE. Russia has always been a member of the OSCE. And I was in charge of OSCE affairs in the foreign ministry when Russia invaded the Crimea and got involved in the Donbas region. So OSCE put a monitoring mission on the ground in the Donbas region with the consent of Russia. I saw the paper because I was part of the drafting team. I saw the paper being returned from Russia with some handwritten comments of Lavrov. I mean, Lavrov personally approved the plan of the OSCE as an observer mission. So now telling everybody, well, you know, we felt left out. We're not part of the system. It's utterly wrong. They have been part of the system. Just to underline what you said.
Thank you. We had another one here.
I'm going to name certain events, and I don't remember the exact order as it happened. So I'm going to say it was between 1978 and 1980. Okay, I'm going to start with Pope John Paul, who was elected 1978.
Yes.
Okay. The same time, the closest advisor of then President Jimmy Carter was Professor Zbigniew Brzezinski, who used to speak with Polish accent.
Yes.
Okay. 19, I think
He
it
grew
was,
up in Canada.
I think it was
Father was ambassador.
I think it was by the end of 1979 or beginning of 1980. First time in history, American president, also Jimmy Carter, visited communist country. First time in history, okay? A year later, less than a year later, in Poland, there was nationwide strikes against the communist government. On top of which, first independent trade union Solidarity was created, and Poland was before the martial law. A year later, Poland was partly free. The Polish people could travel, etc. But my question: do you think these events were just coincidence? That's my question.
Well, like, is there some invisible hand, some?
No, I'm just asking.
Yes,
if
I
you
think,
see it as
yes.
a coincidence, or if you think there was something more to it.
No, of course it wasn't a coincidence, but it was already in December 1970 that the Polish government increased, doubled, tripled even the price of various basic foodstuffs that one needed for Christmas cooking. And the Poles take their Christmas cooking very seriously. And that resulted in the first really significant, massive challenge of Polish society to the regime after 1956, Poznań, and so on. So it was 1970 that set the context for August 1980, when Solidarity emerged, because through the 1970s, there was a whole series of strikes and challenges. I remember Ursus and all the other factories would repeatedly go on strike against the government. And ultimately, the strikers prevailed in August 1980 when the communist negotiators had to go to Canossa, to use an old historical term. They had to go to the shipyards to talk to the strikers and sign the agreement that Solidarity was now an officially existing trade union, except, of course, that it was then suppressed again in December 81. But that was probably inevitable because of the Soviet pressures, right? And also Western weakness at the time, that there was no indication that the West would, aggressively react to a martial law imposition against Solidarity. So I think there was a whole series of events that led to 1980 and the emergence of Solidarity. And of course, the Pope's elevation was a huge event. I consider him to be probably the most important personality of the second half of the 20th century, vastly more important in my book than Gorbachev, because I think Gorbachev was not at all going in to dismantle communism. I think he wanted to reform the Soviet Union.
And save it.
And he just basically messed it up. And it fell apart because he started tinkering with the system, which was really unimprovable. But I think it was the moral certitude that the emergence of JP2 gave the Poles that I think legitimized you. You talked about dissidents, sir, right? So, you know, it was one thing to be Havel and 200, 300 other people around him. It was another thing to be part of a group of 10 million. Solidarity claimed to have 10 million members. That's a legitimate challenge to the government.
Oh, it's nationwide.
It was exactly.
Thank you for your question. We have one last, and then we have one online question.
Many thanks for your words on our Polish Pope elevation. Indeed, it was a huge event, and on Solidarity, 10 million members, it was a big power, yeah, towards the communist regime. But unfortunately, martial law was established in 1981 in December. I remember these times, and it was very, very sad time for me. Just question about this, your opinion that the war in Ukraine postponed Poland's and Hungary's quarrel with Brussels. What does it mean? And there is any evidence? Because you also said that there is the Putin war has saved the V4 group as a whole and improve some our relations with neighbors. I think that it's also a kind of simplified picture of the current situation, and I think that there is no evidence that, you know, the war, the current war and the strategy of Ukraine somehow is change our position towards Brussels and the bureaucrats there. So this.
Well, I think you're right, but that really worries me that there is certainly the possibility that the tensions will come up again, and that Brussels will say rule of law requirement needs to be satisfied, or we're not releasing the money that's due to Warsaw. And that undoubtedly will have to be dealt with somehow, right?
That's right.
So far, it has been sidestepped because everybody understands that at this point, with Putin ante portas, you know, banging on the door, we'd better stay together. We'd better help each other, or else we will fall disunited. You know, we have to stay united. But I think you're right that these problems are not going to go away.
Exactly, and Poland and Hungary are not only two countries which have some problems with Brussels, with bureaucrats in Brussels. Yeah?
Austria is another.
Of course, so that this is
Czechs.
yeah. So
thank you for your comment. We have time just for one more question online. Okay, question that was put online: what do you think Havel he enabled for the judges from the communist era to stay in the position for life? He got the theater Lucerna back as a restitution, while many Americans are still fighting to their modest houses they left behind as refugees.
Yes, well, see, it was all very complicated in the late 80s and early 1990s. You know, the view that Havel expressed, namely that one should simply move forward and not get stuck in examining the past endlessly, it was a legitimate view, because I understand people were saying, look, our real problem has to do with economic reform. We need to privatize this vast country. It really, the Bohemia, Moravia, Slovakia at the time was highly industrialized. And during the transfer of this huge property, we need to figure out how to do it. Right? So let's not worry about who was a spy for the old regime and who was not. And so Havel, I think, expressed the view that Mazowiecki was expressing, we just need to move forward, draw a thick red line in November 1989 and focus on the future. We need to get to the 21st century as partners and sort of worthy candidates for membership in NATO and in the European Union. Yes, but it was, I think, like, saying Germany didn't need to denazify. It did need to denazify before it could start enjoying the great economic successes with Chancellor Erhard in the late 50s. It was preceded by denazification, and that never happened in Eastern Europe. And so it would be easy for me to say, Havel somehow is responsible for it. I think that Havel, like Mazowiecki, like all the other people who were saying, draw a thick red line and look ahead, I think that they intended well. But I think in retrospect, it didn't really work.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure that we could go with this discussion on the certain topics, at least for a day, 2 or 3 more, but unfortunately we are out of time. I just want once again, firstly, to thank you all for coming today to be with us. I would like to thank all our online guests, and also most of everyone. I would like to thank you finding the time to fly here and to give us your presentation on the certain topic that was very interesting to discuss about. We hope to see you again, maybe with part 2 or 3 or 4, and to have you back again. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for coming today.